Hey guys, it's Multiplier. We're Plugin Boutique today, having a look at something called Signal. It's a VST synth made by the guys at Output, and we're going to be making a cool synth sound that's going to sound a little bit like this. Pretty cool, right? So let's dive in and take a look to see how we put it together. Signal works in two halves. We have the pulse engines and the effects, which we can choose between with these two tabs at the top, either pulse engines or effects. So by default, the pulse engine will kick out a very simple pulse for our standard sound, which is the analog saw. So it's generating that pulse, which is in fact a sine wave at a 1/16th division. We can always turn off the pulse engine. If we want to focus in on our individual sounds by themselves without this pulse, we can click Signal right in the middle and that turns it off, so we can play it just like we would a normal instrument. The first thing I like to do is turn off velocity sensitivity. Not because I think it's necessarily a bad thing, I just prefer when I'm initially designing my sound to deal with velocity later on, so I like just turning it off. So I go to the settings wheel here, and we'll just turn it off for this particular pulse engine, or turn it down to 0%. That way it's not velocity sensitive, and it will be the same sound every time I trigger it. So the pulse engine, how does it work? Well, we can choose a different pulse. So if we have a look at this down here, which looks like a wave, and click it, we can choose between 4 different types of pulse. We can choose between a standard wave type, so we can choose wave, then maybe choose a different shape, either something simple like a sine, or something linear like this, or the opposite of linear, as well as more medium and complicated shapes. I like it quite simple for now, so let's do a nice simple linear shape like this. It's nice and plucky. But what we could also do, in fact, is do a more complicated rhythm in terms of we could use an arpeggio or a stepper or a wave sort of thing. So if we click this wave here, we can choose either the step thing, choose something more steppy, I don't know, something like this, or something else. Let's leave it on that. I think that sounds quite cool. And let's explore some of the other rhythm options with Pulse Engine B. So to turn on Pulse Engine B, we need to choose this little power button down here, and let's choose a different sound. So at the moment we have the left on analog saw. I think that's fine. Let's choose a less synthetic sound for this right hand side. So we'll choose analog saw. These are all our synthetic sound. That's why it's under the synths section. If we go to instruments, these are more natural, quote unquote, real sounding things. So we can choose maybe something a bit strange like these percussive stuff, or maybe airy flute might sound cool. Gives it a nice background vibe. So if we hit OK, if we temporarily turn off Pulse Engine A, we can focus in on Pulse Engine B. So we'll turn off Pulse Engine A. It'll still be there, it's just bypassed essentially. So that's our airy flute sound. Pretty cool. Let's turn off velocity sensitivity again for this one. So hit settings, turn off velocity sensitivity. And now what we need to do is turn on some sort of pulse thing for this engine. Right now there's no pulse. Sometimes it can be quite cool to have one side of it, either A or B, with some sort of pulse, but the other side not having a pulse, so you've got this consistent layer behind it. So it's up to you how you want to do it, but I think it might be quite cool to have a rhythm for this second side as well. So we'll turn on the main rhythm and let's choose something. We could have a look at the loop's quite cool. It loops through. We can choose a particular point in the sample, maybe the start, and then choose a loop length, maybe a quarter. So it's looping through that sample at a quarter division. I'm not sure if I like that. Let's maybe go back to the simple wave option, since we've had a look at these, but I think the wave might be quite cool, just a simple sine wave. Except maybe a bit quicker at 16th division. I like that. But what we can also do now is actually add in a second layer of rhythmic interest, and that's what this second rhythm on the right here is for. So we can turn that on, and by default what that would do is it will actually map that second rhythmic thing to the stereo thing it's doing. So you'll hear it's moving it through the stereo image from the left to the right, using that pulse, of course, which we can change using the same set of options as before by clicking this wave symbol. But let's leave it on sine still, because I think it sounds quite cool. But I personally think that stereo effect that we've now added with the second rhythm is a bit too drastic. We need to tame it back a bit. And to do that, we have to hop into the advanced settings. So we'll hit advanced, and this is where we can choose what each one of these rhythms is actually mapped to, or which one of these rhythms is modulating what. So we can see here this main rhythm send is by default mapped to the volume of the sound and not the pan, and then by default the second rhythm is mapped to the pan. So in fact, if we hold down the note and ease back on this pan parameter here, we'll hear the difference. I quite like it there, but I'll show you if it's reduced all the way. I quite like it there. Just gives it that little bit of movement to the side. So now I've got our second side somewhat working. We'll hop out of advanced mode. We will turn back on the left-hand side with this little button here. It's getting quite loud, so I'm just going to turn down the overall level of our preset very slightly with the slider, just so we don't clip. Now we have a bit of a sound going. Let's add some effects before we have a final hop back into this section to do some final tweaks. So for the effects, what I think would be quite cool is if we hop into effects, let's add some reverb to the overall sound. So we're under the global tab right now, the global one in the middle versus the pulse. So the global tab, and we will turn on reverb. Pretty cool, right? And finally, what I thought I'd show you is how to use these macros at the top of the screen. So we're going to map one of these macros to do something. So these four rings here, at the moment they're all turned off, are in fact general purpose macro knobs. So just like how in Massive you have those macros at the bottom right hand side, or if you have an instrument rack in Ableton, or there are loads of synths that have these macros, general purpose parameters that you can map to one or multiple things to do something. So let's map one of these macros to, say, a cutoff of a filter. Quite a standard thing to do, but it should result in quite a cool effect and quite a useful macro parameter. So to do this mapping of the macro at the top here, we need to hit this button up here, this guy, and we will choose, so we need to go to the empty slot down here and do assign, and then navigate to a parameter inside of Signal, then click the knob or slider to assign it to the slot. So let's hop into Pulse Engines. We need to find the filter. So we'll hop into Advanced. We will go to Low Pass Adaptive, so a low pass filter. And then if we turn it on and then choose Filter, and it says Assign here, or the cutoff of the filter. Pretty cool. And then while we're at it, let's also map it to a low pass filter for the other side, Pulse Engine B. So we get an assign, Pulse Engines, and then low pass adaptive, turn it on, and we'll choose the cutoff. And now what we have to do is essentially define the high and the low limits for this cutoff mapping, so that depending on where we are on the slider, it determines where in that cutoff position we are. And that's mostly trial and error to figure out how it works. So what we can do is for this one here, if we click this off down here, we can choose something logical like dark bright. So at the bottom end here, we want it to be closed off. So we want the filter to be low in the terms of the cutoff position. And then when it goes all the way up to bright up here, we want the filter to be fully open. So the cutoff position needs to be at the max. So you need to play around with these settings to dial that in. So I think if we try and move that through like that. And as we move this parameter one, this macro, we can see the actual parameter down here. So what I'll do, in fact, at this stage, so I can make it a little bit easier to see, is I'll assign that macro one to a parameter, or it's one of these main knobs on my Ableton push. As I'm moving this parameter from bright through to dark, it's changing these parameters here, the cutoff position of these low pass filters. So now hopefully, as I play a note, we'll hear the effect. And from memory, I think you might need the latest update of Signal. So depending on when you got this, if you have got Signal, you might need to update it to actually do this macro assigning yourself. But it's definitely worth doing. It's one of probably the second most important feature behind the Pulse engine is the ability to have these main four macros mapped. And there you go. That's how we make that particular sound using Signal from the guys at Output. We've covered all the major bases in terms of things like the Pulse Engine, effects, and assigning macros. They're the main things. There's a few more fiddly little details, but you can explore that as you go. It's a case of just getting in there and making cool sounds now. So I've been Multiplier. Hope you enjoyed.